The second half of this seminar is as exciting as it can be. We will first have the keynote from Bart de Witte. Bart is the initiator of Hippo AI Foundation. Hello, Bart. And I would say that in the recent 1 year, I have not heard more inspiring vision than what I've heard from Bart. So it is indeed a great pleasure and privilege to be part of this conversation. And I hope you find Bart's vision as inspiring and actually need of the hour, for the world that we are living in current times, as I found it. So I would request my colleagues to, bring in the next presentation from Bart Devite, and after that we will go to Dr. Liesbet, and then we will roll into a Q&A session. So I would request all of you to bring your questions as you listen to his inspiring vision. So over to Bart's presentation.
My name is Bart Witte. I'm based in Berlin. I'm a European. I've been working 20 years in the health tech sector and focused quite a lot of my last years on artificial intelligence. And I'm going to guide you through my presentation and try to convince you why we should, when we develop medical artificial intelligence, make it something like a democracy that is by the people, of the people, and for the people. And this first slide already kind of explains it why, because this is an image of a Japanese artist, Roy Ikeda. And my biggest fear is then when we digitize and when we have the opportunity to lower inequalities in our society, that we still keep on doing that what we always did, and that digitization leads to higher inequalities. And that's what I want to fight. Just a small disclaimer when I talk about AI. I talk about the general broad context of AI. I'm not going to differentiate between algorithms, machine learning, deep learning, all kind of methods that are there. So AI is that what I talk about, although there is a differentiation to make. And as an introduction, I want to, of course, refer to this exceptional year that is very much in focus of healthcare and innovation. 2020 is the most sustainable year in quite a lot of aspects. And as we know, we are all confronted with a crisis. And what I kind of focused myself during March, April, when the crisis hit Europe quite hard, and I started seeing what I can do with my people, with my teams, to start to help. And what I've witnessed is something that I've never witnessed before, because suddenly people were opening up doors and we were breaking down walls for global collaboration. We were opening up data so we could create models that allow us to predict more specific onsets. And the most fascinating thing I've been part of is a friend of mine, Guy Calatranti, who is from Berkeley, California, and he called out and said, hey, do we want to start a group to create open source medical supplies? And medical supplies, these are surgical face masks, goggles, masks, air purifier, respirators, ventilators, and everybody said, yes, let's try this because there's going to be a large need. And what happened there is something I've not seen before or witnessed before, because we created this Facebook group, and within just a very short time, in 2 weeks, we had 50 different 3D printable mask designs that were downloadable as open source in Thingiverse. And this is of course a bit of a joke on the left, but there was a lot of creativity. People started to collaborate, and people starting to help, opening up their designs, augmenting the designs. Others were doing clinical research on the designs. People started to hack ventilators to see how can we save multiple lives with one single ventilator. So people, the most conservative said this is not possible. It was done, it was possible. So all these kind of things and innovation came without barriers, without regulatory barriers, without global barriers or country barriers or national barriers. And within only 8 weeks, we collected a group of over 100,000 people that worked in 42 countries that created over 25 million of pieces of open source development medical supplies by using digital manufacturing capacities, maker spaces, 3D printing, injection molding, all these kind of technologies were suddenly in use that I had never seen. And the FDA approved some of these designs that we created, or that the community created, and they liberated it for clinical use, all in less than 2 months. Amazing innovation, and it shows when people have a joint enemy, and we have a joint purpose, that when we have a joint purpose, everybody starts aligning into the same direction and start to collaborate. And that goes really easy. And that's what I learned, that when we have a joint purpose and a joint vision, then it's so much easier to collaborate. And I make always this joke that the moment where China, the US, and Russia will collaborate is the moment when we are all attacked by alien ships, because we have a joint enemy. And there was another thing that I related to being open. When I started this, and I'm going to talk about later about this, but I started to dig a lot in history. What were the big moments that where society advanced? And I start with a few hundred years before Christ, that one of the main principles of Hippocrates was really telling that you need to open exchange your medical knowledge amongst your peers. That was part of the oath that doctors needed to take. Then we had in Europe the Enlightenment, where we distanced ourselves from the church and we separated church and government. And it was actually roughly means enlightenment is sharing knowledge and light, human life. And then in 1991, there was the original internet opened as an open source, because the TCP IP protocols, HTTP protocols, they were open source. Everybody could create kind of a server, and then I could be a common IP provider. And then now today, if you see startups creating a prototype in just 3 days, that is just because they can access open source libraries on GitHub, and 60% of these tools that they build are based on open source, shares things that we exchange as a common good that is there as a digital good. So I find this kind of fascinating, because it's really advancing our society, and we tend to forget that. And this led me to think, what is the foundation that we're going to build AI on? What is because I think AI as a technology is one of the most transformational technologies, because it's all about creating or discovering knowledge and then applying that knowledge into the process of care. And I created a vision that was called Hippo AI, which relates to Hippocrates, of course, because he laid the foundation of modern medicine. But it also relates to the animal that is one of the animals that is really protective about their children, so they think in future generations, something that with our quarterly driven way of thinking is not always in focus anymore. And I started to think, what is the biggest hack I can do in healthcare? Because if I was an executive at IBM, I was leading the digital health market, and I said, like, this is not what I want to do. The progress that we were making was not changing anything. After 20 years, I saw that the healthcare costs were still going up. Access is still not there. So what is the biggest hack you can do in healthcare? What do hackers do is they get access. And so I think the biggest hack that I could do is really to give everybody access to healthcare. And I think that should be one of the main visions, that what is the greatest thing you can do in life is really give access. And how do you give access? Well, I think we need to think about something similar as open source software for AI, that we say, like, let's open source AI in healthcare. Because if we open source AI, we get a lot of companies like the libraries on GitHub that can start using it and adopting it, and we don't get monopolized or colonized by big tech companies that are entering the market and are way much better in working with closed systems. And to start with a thought experiment, because everybody says, like, how are we going to make money when we open source things? Because we're not going to be able to create an economy anymore. And I guess, like, okay, this thought experiment, there is a lot of progress now on the in vitro meat development, and there is Live Kindly was this open source movement in that world that just open sourced the recipes to print plant-based meat. And suddenly there was an acceleration, because there was access to knowledge, people starting to share, and you see all these kind of things happening, and this technology is just following Moore's law. It's always becoming cheaper, because like in 2013, it costed $2.5 million to buy a kilo of beef. and now it costs only $80 to buy a kilo of beef, which is not coming from a cow, which is lab-grown meat. And this is going further down. And so we have a really exponential negative price development by this. And then I ask myself, the question we need to ask if we continue that path of open source meat production, and imagine you can reduce the price of the actual meat price in the Western countries where I live that by 90%. And suddenly, because of these open source technology is cheap and available, we all collaborate, we can produce the substance of opening a restaurant, which is mostly the cost our staff, and the other one is the meat. The question we need to ask then, are we going to have more or less restaurants? I believe we're going to have more restaurants because we have access, or we lower the basic cost to opening a restaurant. And then they are going to compete on an experience level. They're going to create nice interiors, nice services. Yes, there will be some kind of McDonald's and there will be fully automated food stores, but it's not killing the business in the country. It's opening up the doors for other people to start a business. So lowering down the barriers to get access to that technology creates more business. So it's completely ludicrous to think that when we open source medical AI, there's not going to be any opportunity. And this kind of next phase of economical value creation is what we call the experience economy. And when I'm in healthcare, I want better experience. And I think everybody else agrees on that. We don't want to compete of you own the knowledge that is saving the life, but as you are born in Africa, you don't get access. I think it's completely an old-fashioned way of thinking. And in the same way with food, when you bring it down, you can also probably solve one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is creating zero hunger, because you would give access to the technology to people who can't necessarily afford that. These things are getting really cheap. And when we democratize technology, people can start building things and perhaps create some kind of sustainable industries locally, and not creating dependencies on other regions for their future. And that's what I noticed in healthcare when I was doing my research. And it's like, I entered 20 years ago the tech space because I love tech, because everything got democratized. And I have a phone in my hand that has a computing capacity of a Cray supercomputer of the 80s, and I can do things that only probably the president of the United States was able to do 20 years ago, and it got democratized. And that's what I love. Everything gets cheaper, everything gets more accessible. But in healthcare, that is the opposite. Like, we don't talk about Moore's law in healthcare, we talk about Aron's law. And there was a paper being published that showed that the price of drug development goes exponentially up since years and continuously to rise. Although we have more bioinformatics, we have technology, we have data, the price still goes up and up and up. And access is still not solved. So I think we need to ask ourselves the question, when we develop our digital future in healthcare, do we want to follow Moore's law, or do we want to repeat on following Aron's law for digital age? And I really thought a lot, and I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people, and I think there are ways that we can break down Aron's law and start following Moore's law. In Europe, it's kind of fascinating as well when you talk about open source. If you look at the market today in Europe of meta companies, there are 35,000 meta companies in Europe that all have less than 50 employees. That's 59%. And 80% of the meta companies have less than 50 employees. And that means that these companies are well spread around Europe in villages, in things. They are not centralized, they are decentralized, and they create local jobs. Amazing. I like that. I love it. But if you ask these people that, are you confident that you will transfer your company in the digital age and make intelligent equipment, 70% can't, because they are really small and they need to solve complex challenges. So thinking about it, I prefer a future keeping these 35,000 companies, because they are well spread, as having 3 monopoles that are centralized. And there was another way that I think that we are stuck in that IP-based economy, and we should transform that. As an argument I used, the iPhone was exactly a really good example of disruption. We had in Europe Nokia. Nokia was full of, sorry for my words, but arrogant engineers that had most of the IP. If you look at the R&D and sales ratio in this graph, you see that Nokia was spending so much on R&D, and Apple was not spending that much on R&D. Apple didn't even have that much IP on telephony. Still, they managed to create a product that created an experience where people were paying 3 times the price for something else that has the same components, the same IP, but it was different design, it was a different experience. And I think that's where we need to get to in healthcare. Compete on experience and not compete on IP. There is a future behind IP. I don't believe in too much in IP, because I think if we think about AI, we need to think about what's going to happen with AI in 50 years. What if we create an artificial general intelligence in medicine? Like, I don't know if it's possible. People think that's going to be there's singularity, and there's all this kind of future visions, but we are building the foundation if it would happen today. So I think we need to think more in generations. We used to live in 150 years ago in a generation where people started building cathedrals in Europe, and then even the people who designed and architected that cathedral, they never see the finished product. Like the Sagrada Familia is still not finished, and it takes them 135 years. The Colonna took 800 years. So we should start thinking to build something that is going to serve our next generations in 50 years. We should not short think about this. There is also another thing. What I'm afraid of is that when you think about AI, is that we create asymmetries between larger organizations, private organizations, and individuals. And I think we see already these geopolitics coming there with asymmetries, because India just banned 60 Chinese apps in that, because there were asymmetries in information, or data was being collected in these apps, and there were quite a lot of fears that data leads to some kind of control. In Europe, we had asymmetries between the medical substance that you need to produce drugs, and because they were all produced in China. So asymmetries and building resilience and sovereignty as an answer on this is really important. In Europe, another thing, when you think about algorithms and business models, there is one single company that decides in Europe for 92% of the Europeans, when we look for something in the internet, what we're going to find. One single company. Imagine that happens in healthcare. In Europe, we had a lot of billions of EU funding on research to try to avoid this, and we create our own search engine for Europe. And then they saw that investing in research alone is not the thing. It is the business model. It is the platform. It is the network effect. So there is much more than just having IP. It is way more than doing that. Another important, and I want to share this all because I want you to think and read, and this is what I can advise you as well, is the Nobel Prize laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who is one of the influences of myself, that said like the information asymmetries will always lead to inequality. If somebody owns the knowledge, then he will create artificial scarcity on that knowledge to create economical value. And then you see inequality. So that is perhaps something that we need to think of. We need to change a paradigm. And to think why we should do that is just to think, well, are we going to be able to compete to countries like China in Europe? Because there are companies like this one, United Imaging Health China, that is doing exactly the same thing as Philips and Siemens Healthineers are doing. They're creating MRI, CT, diagnostical products, and they're connecting this to the cloud. But think about this. They have 1.4 billion inhabitants in their country alone. They have no privacy, no ethical rules in that. And they have, like Shanghai alone has 5 billion on capital to spend. So do we think that when we follow that same business model as we saw with the search industry, that we will be able to compete? I don't think so. I think we will end up in a monopoly of medical knowledge, creating asymmetries. And that's what I want to avoid. And the way to avoid it is something that I started thinking of, is looking very different at data. Data for me is not oil or gold or whatever. Data is not a commodity that is tradable, because the data in healthcare is something that is extracted out of my body and belongs to society or belongs to you. There is no legal definition on who owns data. There is a really gray zone in there. But for me, data is not a community. That was the one part I was looking at. The other part I was looking at is, what are our values? What is the value system we are living in? And in the European health part, and the startups on the right should look a bit more like the Silicon Valley culture, but the European values in healthcare are much more based on inclusivity, on the beneficiary is humanity and not shareholders. So the outcome is about plurality, and the data is about open, because that was what Hippocrates defined. So I feel like, oh, we are injecting here a very new value system, so we're going to end up in a different system. And I think we should start, again, looking at a very simple thing. We should not look at data as a commodity, because data for me is people and data is human life. And that's as simple as it is. If we look at it as data is human life, and we cannot create a commodity or start trading or buying or things, then we end up in a different world. The other influences that I had is that if we go for monetization, then we probably will end up, and I can also advise to read Nick Holdry, who wrote a book, The Cost of Connection, and became a friend of mine from the London School of Economics, that if we go for data monetization, that there will, or at the end, there will be no part of human life that will be extractable to create economical value. And latest, when Neuralink comes and our thoughts become data, and we start thinking about our thoughts as being something, as a commodity that can be commoditized and traded, I think latest then we're going to think, oh, stop it, because my thoughts are mine. But the same thing happens with your health data. The other one, as you probably know, Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book of surveillance capitalism, tells as well that if you have private organizations that are capturing that of information, they always will be an advantage to manipulate your behavior to serve their business model. And that's where I'm afraid of. If that happens in healthcare, who tells that we're going to use that technology for the greater good or staying healthy? The other thing that I looked at in as well is, if we build AI, we need to do it based on our fundamental rights. And there is something like the right of integrity of a person. That means that we need to be control about our own selves. There is also something as informed consent and the prohibition of making your human body as part of a financial gain. And one of the most striking experiences that I had is that there was this experiment in South Korea lately, where there was this mother that replicated a deceased daughter as a digital twin into a VR world. And I'm just going to show you a little excerpt of that. Okay, this was a very short clip. I think you have seen enough. So the person is so real that that mother is thinking that this is really a daughter, has created emotions. But the question I ask, who owns that data? Who owns that replica? And there is also a startup here called Replica AI that downloads all your chat history and everything else and can create an avatar of yourself. I looked with some legal advisors to the terms and conditions. When you start using that app, you don't own the AI model that is based on your own data. You own the data, but you don't own the model. So I think we need to really consider what we are doing here for the future, because otherwise we're going to lose our fundamental right on integrity. And I'm not going to go too deep in that. I can talk for hours. But the last point I want to make is, before I start in bringing a solution, is ethics. Now, in Europe alone, there are 128 groups that published ethical rules on AI. The most well-known is the European high-level expert group that published the guidelines for trustworthy AI. And then when I looked at the final paper, I was really surprised, because the framework doesn't really explicit in the first component of what they call trustworthy AI, which is lawful AI, which means bringing in our fundamental rights. So I was really confused. And then there was this other paper that I read from Ethical Washing Machines. They say, like, the research and development of AI should always serve humanity in respect of privacy of the individual and protect the individual rights. This sentence comes from the Beijing Principles of AI, comes from China. So if this all is being described in things, then I say, like, exactly like Marietje Schaake from Stanford, when everything is ethics, nothing is. So I think we need to look more at the design of what we build. I think on the ownership, we can cut this here, because otherwise I'm going to take too much time. But I'm going to the Hippo AI vision. So what I created to solve this. I created an NGO, humanitarian, I call it really humanitarian, non-profit that really wants to accelerate the open development of AI. Because we believe in that foundation, that new foundation, AI should be accessible to the general public, free of economical interest. We want to serve humanity, regardless from race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, creed, or political affiliation. So at the end, it's of the people, by the people, and for the people. How do we do this? Well, we collect donations to build global data commons for AI. People think there's already a lot of data. No, there is not. There are no global data economies that include all the biodiversity in one single data set on a specific disease. We want to, as mentioned before, share them without economical interest. So we can publish them under an open knowledge license that at the end accelerate medical discoveries that are available to all. It's a simple hack. We as humanity can decide where we want to donate our data to. If we donate to my NGO or somebody else that really protects it for privatizing the knowledge you extracted, then I think we can create a different future. How do we do this? We always partner with one single patient that has a specific disease. This patient becomes the face and donates our name and the data and the face for advocating for the campaign. So other patients that are suffering from that same disease can donate with money or can donate with their data. And then what we do then is with that data, we create these global data sets that are available to all under that license. So this is our goal. We want to build the biggest global data sets that represent the global population, irrespective of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, creed, for any disease. It's going to be a long trajectory, but I know that nobody was doing this before in that sense, so let's start doing this. What are we trying to get as an outcome from this for humanity? On a macro level, we are creating data and AI commons, like AI is a common good. We want to avoid information asymmetries. We want to protect the human rights. We want to solve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And on a micro level, we want to create a movement driven by people, patients that want to democratize AI. We want to create public awareness, educate, because people are not aware that we can change the future ourselves. We want to accelerate data donation and accelerate collaboration. So we want to create communities and around that what we create. So at the end, we have what we can call the Hippo AI, which is based on an open competition. There is the ownership is common, the data is common. Medical knowledge keeps on being democratized, and we most probably are going to be able to solve health inequalities when we do this. All the other methods, I don't think they work because they lead to, as I mentioned before, to most probably monopolies. We started yesterday with our first campaign. It's called United Data Defeat Cancer. As we want to create some visual attraction, we used ASCII code. I'm a bit of a nerd, so ASCII is cool. That creates a kind of a campaign awareness. And the first project is called Victoria, as the patient is called Victoria. She's a breast cancer patient that donated her data and is helping us to create that movement. So she shared all the data about her disease and she's calling out for all the others. And we're using social media to do so. We're using Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're going to tapping all these digital communities because we need to do that. If we don't start to advocate and using influencers, nobody's going to hear from that. So we need to be actively promoting this new vision of the future. We even work with influencers, and we kind of have created an Instagram filter for changing the breast, because it's about breast cancer, into ASCII code. So people can show that our bodies are made of data, and when we donate data, we can solve inequalities and solve disease at the end, but in an equal way. So this is what we are doing in the awareness month, but we decided not to do it a month. We continue 12 months, and then next year we start with Victoria 2.0 and on, because I think personally, yes, it's important to have these awareness months, but our campaign should not stop at the end of October. We even have created merchandising, all based on these ASCII codes, because we need to collect money, because I don't want to collect money from a government. I don't want to collect money from private institutions, because I want to be free and be funded by the people, because otherwise we will we will get influenced, and I've enough experience in that. We will need to push to, we will be pushed to certain standards and share or share the interests of others, and we don't want to do that. So it's of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this is in German, but I really want to give Victoria a voice, because that's what we do. We give patients a voice. It's subtitled in English, so I hope you allow me to show the video.
Also ich bin Victoria und im Sommer 2019 wurde bei mir Brustkrebs diagnostiziert. Das allererste Gefühl war Angst. Man weiß im ersten Moment nicht mehr, woran man sich festhalten kann. Meine Behandlung hat mit Chemotherapie begonnen. Danach wurde ich operiert. Danach bekam ich die Bestrahlung, Antikörpertherapie und Antihormontherapie. Ich würde sagen, ich hatte großes Glück. Mein Brustkrebs wurde als solcher erkannt, rechtzeitig diagnostiziert, die Behandlung eingeleitet und ich kann wieder ein gesundes Leben leben. Und dieses Glück bleibt vielen Menschen verwehrt. Victoria 1.0 ist das erste globale Datenset von Brustkrebspatientinnen. Daten, die dafür verwendet werden, Menschenleben zu retten. Wir haben eine große Ungerechtigkeit in der medizinischen Versorgung. Viele Menschen haben keinen Zugang zu medizinischer Versorgung, sie haben nicht mal einen Zugang zu einer Diagnose. Und das andere Problem ist, dass bereits Daten gesammelt werden. Es wird Wissen daraus generiert. Dieses Wissen wird aber privatisiert. Die Hippo AI Foundation ist eine Non-Profit-Organisation, die mit Hilfe von Daten und künstlicher Intelligenz Wissen generiert, das allen Menschen zur Verfügung steht, ohne ökonomische Interessen. Dieses Wissen können wir nutzen, um Brustkrebs rechtzeitig, frühzeitig, vielleicht sogar bevor er entsteht, zu erkennen und damit Menschenleben zu retten. Menschenleben überall auf dieser Welt. Mein persönlicher Wunsch wäre, dass jeder Mensch Zugang zur Medizin hat, als Gemeinwohl und nicht als Handelsware. Jeder kann Teil unserer Bewegung sein. Durch Datenspenden, durch Geldspenden oder einfach darüber sprechen. Unite data, defeat cancer.
What at the end we want to do is creating AI of the people, by the people, and for the people. Because this is the only way how AI will be able to serve us and not first serve the shareholder interest or political interest as in China. So it needs to be democratized. This is the end of my story, but it's not the end of my journey. So we want to, with these campaigns, want to shape a world that is different, data set by data set, and it should be a world I or others want to live in. So unite data, defeat cancer, unite data, defeat inequalities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for sharing this excellent vision, Bart. And I think data remains the story which ties, all the presentations that we see in this program today. And next is coming Professor Liesbet, and she's a research professor. And while she might be all nerdy, given her work, which is almost like rocket science, but talking about simulation and in some ways learning, deep learning, and I'm very, very impressed, and her explanation is so clear, so amazing, that I invite you all to hear one more very inspiring and path-breaking work. So I would like to have the next presentation from Professor Liesbet, and over to my colleagues again.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'd like to discuss with you how to expand the potential of digitalization going from e-health to something called in silico medicine, because in silico medicine will allow to really unlock the full potential of all the digital tools that we have developed and are developing in the field of healthcare. So what is, or how is e-health connected to in silico medicine? In 2014, while the European Parliament was putting together its action plan on e-health, it mentioned at some point that there were a number of successful e-health initiatives like VPH and like computer modeling and simulation that should be embraced and that should be continued in the field or in the scope of e-health. Now, what is this VPH that was referred to there? VPH in this case stands for virtual physiological human. And that refers to a kind of computer modeling and simulation where we start from the physiology of a patient and then try to use computer modeling and simulation to address questions in all aspects of healthcare. So it's not one single model. There is not going to be one virtual human, but it's a suite of models. And the virtual physiological human is more like the endpoint, but where the journey is the thing that is most important. So synonyms to VPH could be in silico medicine, digital twins, avatars, and in the scope of this presentation, I will mostly be talking about in silico medicine. And so what I will do is first discuss what is in silico medicine, how wide it goes, some examples, and then say where we currently stand. So what is the state of the art in silico medicine? And I will end with some challenges, and some of these challenges are very similar to challenges in a more limited interpretation of the concept e-health. So what is in silico medicine? In silico medicine, the word in silico refers to the use of computer modeling and simulation. It is chosen in analogy to in vitro and in vivo, where the first is referring to use of glassware in the laboratory, so lab experiments, and the second one is referring to animal or human experiments. Now, in silico medicine is something that can be descriptive, that can be integrative, can be predictive. It refers to or does not make any assumption on the type of modeling technology. So all type of computer modeling technologies can be considered in silico medicine, all kinds of inputs, all kinds of length and time scales. It also doesn't belong to any particular branch of medicine. So all the organ systems can be modeled or can be considered in silico medicine. And the computer modeling could even serve to connect different organ systems. And then with respect to the treatment strategies, devices, drugs, advanced therapies, all these are investigated by in silico medicine approaches. Now, in a classical definition of in silico medicine, we say that we use computer modeling and simulation to look at prevention, diagnostics, treatment, and follow-up. So all these aspects of the healthcare field can be treated or can benefit from the additional tool that in silico has to offer. And of course, there is the realization of the 3 R's, the replacement, reduction, and refinement of the use of animal experiments in biomedical research. Now, in silico medicine, depending on who you're talking to, depending on who will be using the tool, can have a slightly different phase. You can, when a patient is using in silico medicine or a citizen, it can be to do personal health forecasting. So really have subject-specific real-time simulations and predictions of where the health of a patient is evolving to based on data from wearable sensors or other readouts. When a doctor is using this kind of in silico technology, it could be in the form of a digital patient. So using computer modeling and simulation for clinical decision-making support. And then there is also the biomedical industry. There is the biomedical research community that can use in silico trials or in silico clinical trials to help realize or help better stratify and improve the actual clinical trials that they have to run. So this one is specific for the industry and for people looking at translation. Now, these last 2 points of view have been declared in roadmaps that you can see on the right of the slide here that were developed by the VPH community together with a lot of stakeholders. And they're still freely available online. Now, when I say in silico medicine, this really is a spectrum. I already said that we don't make any assumption on what kind of model technology to use or what kind of data. And so in silico really is a spectrum. And you could say that the 2 ends of this spectrum are purely data-driven models on the one hand, so called black box models, where you don't use any prior data, you really rely, you don't use any prior knowledge, you really rely on the data. So AI, machine learning, statistics, bioinformatics, those are the phenomenological models on the black box side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the white box models, which are based on first principles, based on physics, but they're also very hard to obtain because it's very rare that when you make a model of a biological process or of a disease, that you can model every mechanistic detail, or that you know every mechanistic detail. This is possible when you go towards models of devices, but when you go towards models of drugs and diseases, this becomes something that you want to aspire to, but that you will never reach. So in reality, most of the models will use a combination of known mechanisms and data, and they will be somewhere in the middle called gray box model. Now, these different approaches can really work together. So, of course, everything starts from experimental observations, whether you use the data directly or where you first do an interpretation of the data to end up with a mechanism and then translate that mechanism into a model. What you see here in the slide on the top is that you start from clinical data. This can be health monitoring, this can be omics data, clinical reports, medical images, whatever is available. And there are two strategies. Either you use that, what you see here on the left, for mechanistic modeling, where we start with a whole bunch of knowledge that we have already accumulated over the last decades, where different models are already available, that you can then plug the new information into, encode that into the existing models, calibrate the model, optimize it, and validate it. This kind of models then provide a tool to look at hypothesis testing, to look at interpretation of what is going wrong, how it works, what the mechanism is, and to make predictions. On the right-hand side, you see statistical models, AI models, machine learning models that take the data and process the data. And what this is really good for is to automatically extract parameters, features, find new metrics or hidden patterns in the data that will, for instance, lead you to patient stratification. So these two approaches are very complementary. And just to illustrate this, here is a small example in the field of cardiology, where the group in Oxford that this example was borrowed from, they started with a patient cohort for which they had ECGs available. These patients all had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And so they analyzed the ECG information and they extracted several biomarkers. Then they did a clustering on this to come up with certain groups of patients, to do a clustering of the features. And based on the clustering of the features, they could actually define ECG phenotypes. So you had the different patterns. If you see in the middle of the figure on the top, you had the different wave patterns that were identified in the clustering algorithm that also corresponded to slightly different images of the heart itself. So what this data-driven approach was able to do was identify different phenotypes that you had in this heterogeneous patient population. Now, in a second step, in the mechanistic step, they took the same MRI data and they turned this into patient-specific models of the heart. With this as a background, they then started adapting the mechanisms. They tried to understand with the model that they had, the multi-scale mechanistic model of heart functioning. They tried to understand what they had to adapt, what kind of ion channel they had to change, or what kind of features in the model had to be altered in order to arrive at exactly the same ECG wave readout as you had in the different categories of patients that were identified with the clustering approach. This then provided the interpretation of the different phenotypes that were analyzed. And so this approach, where you combine both data-driven and mechanistic modeling, really provides you a way to first identify which patients I have and what different categories I have, and then also to answer the why question. Why are these patients in a specific category? What is going wrong, and how can we treat them? So with this introduction of in silico medicine and all that it could entail, I'd like to discuss now what is the current state of the art in silico medicine in the whole of healthcare, but focusing mainly on in silico medicine in industrial and academic environment. So when we think about in silico tools that are used currently in R&D for devices and drugs, they could they have their place all along the development R&D pipeline. So there's a lot of models that are being used at the stage of discovery and ideation, where you can do virtual prototyping, where you can do design optimization. And so in this first loop, where you go from invention, preclinical, up to clinical, and sometimes have to do iterations, models can play a big role. Then you go towards the clinical testing phase, where models could also help to stratify patients or better design your clinical trial, up until the point where you go to the regulator and get a decision. At that point, you have your product launch if everything goes well, and you can do you have to do your post-marketing monitoring, where you can also get all the data and use that. So that would actually be the second step. Once you have your product that is launched, you get all the monitoring in, and from all of that data, you can use that to validate a computer model or to build or reinforce your computer model, and then use that real world data to further optimize and do another cycle of your prototyping and go to the next generation product development. Now, when I say models can be used all along the R&D track, what does that mean? For instance, for medical devices, here are some examples of models that can be used somewhere along the R&D pipeline. So of course, if you have a device, you can make a model of a device. You can make a model of a pacemaker, you can make a model of a pump, and then look at how it functions, whether it functions from a physical point of view, whether it does everything that you want it to do, and answer some design questions. You could also use models to simulate the anatomy and to investigate whether the device, if you want to put it in, whether it fits, what location, how you should enter the device, all of those questions. You can simulate the physiology, for instance, of the heart, and then you can combine this with the model of your pacemaker and see and look at the interaction between both. You can simulate chemical toxicology. In toxicology, computer models are used to a large extent, and so those tools can also be used to look at some of the toxicology components of your device. You can simulate the manufacturing of your device, for instance, in 3D printing. Computer models are widely used to investigate what geometries are interesting, what settings the printer should have. You can have your model that is simulated inside, or your simulations that are embedded in a device. For instance, subcutaneous insulin pumps that use readouts of the blood and that use a computer model to predict how the levels of insulin will vary over time, so that they can, in a timely manner, inject or release the insulin in the bloodstream. Your computational model can be a device. Your simulation can be a device if you want to do planning of certain surgeries related to arteries, related to the heart, related to the skeleton. Your simulation can be the device that actually gives advice to the surgeon. You can simulate different treatment strategies and then offer these to the surgeon so that course of action. They can be used to simulate clinical trials, in this case for a mammogram, or they can be used to incorporate real-world data and then do deep learning to get to a next stage of your device design. These are all some kinds of examples. Here you see this is another view on a current state-of-the-art project called the Living Heart project from Dassault Systèmes, where they have built, with the help of a lot of academic and industrial and regulatory partners, they have built a comprehensive model of the heart, a multi-scale model going from really ion channel level to the patient-specific geometries. And so this can be used to either provide insight into heart function and disease, but it can also be used as a virtual test environment for different devices, different pacemakers, different valves. It can generate specific data that can be used for regulatory purposes, and it can also be used to provide clinical diagnosis or personalized treatment strategies. Now, in silico medicine has been growing over the last decade or so, really very fast. If you look at these results from a survey in 2014 that was performed amongst 35 medical device companies, all part of the MDIC consortium, so the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. The question was, where do you use currently in silico tools in your R&D pipeline. And then you see there's a lot of use of computer modeling and simulation in the early phases, discovery and prototyping. And then there is this use during or after regulatory submission and post-marketing monitoring. But there at that point, none of the 35 were actually using in silico modeling during the clinical testing phase. Now, only a few years later, the FDA approved a product for release to patients without doing a single physical clinical trial, only with a pure in silico clinical trial. Now, it's a specific situation. So what was the situation? This was a pacemaker from Medtronic. Obviously, Medtronic already has developed a lot of pacemakers, and they had consistently used computer models to do so and gathered a lot of information from the existing pacemakers. But now they wanted to change something in the lead wire so that there was no longer, the pacemaker would no longer be an inhibition for patients to undergo an MRI. The problem with the MRI is that the electromagnetic fields that are created around the lead wire going from the battery to the device would create an increase in temperature around the lead wire and would damage the tissues. So what was done for regulatory approval of this pacemaker, there was a lot of in vitro tests in soil blocks. Then there were in vivo tests in animal studies, in pig studies in this case, where they showed validation, where they showed the validity of the computational model that they developed. And then they used their computational model and they simulated 1 million different MRI imaging schemes. And they were able to show that with all of these different imaging schemes, that in none of those MRI sequences, the increase in temperature around the lead wire would be more, or the modulation of the electromagnetic field would be more than what you have normally occurring as natural variation in patients. So they were confidently able to show that there would be no problem with this design of the lead wire. And FDA reviewing all the evidence, knowing what the model was already, or seeing what the model was able to do, seeing the validation in the animal setting, and then the extrapolation to the human, they decided that this was enough evidence to allow the pacemaker to be released onto in the patient population, meaning that Medtronic did not have to go through a clinical trial of 250 patients of 2 years. So saving money on that end, but also releasing an MRI compatible pacemaker 2 years earlier in the patient population. This was really the first time a full in silico clinical trial was used as the only clinical trial step in a regulatory submission at FDA. Now, around that same time, there was a new survey that was performed, and there were, at that time, only 19% of all the respondents, again, these were medical device companies, but also pharma companies, that were not using computer modeling and simulation. And 46% were actually using computer modeling simulation in regulatory dossiers. And if you then look at, so for various, on the left, you see for which regulatory agencies they were used. And so most of those are in FDA and in EU. If you look at why these companies decided to use computer modeling and simulation, that was mostly to reduce time to market, reduce cost to market, and reduce uncertainty in different stages, but also to reduce the risk on humans during clinical trials, for instance. Now, another sign that in silico medicine has been making big strides forward, taking big steps forward, is the boom in the amount of companies that are not just active in silico, like big software companies or big device companies, but the presence of companies solely focused on providing in silico medicine services in various application domains and based on data, or imaging based on data. So different variations, different kinds of computer modeling and simulation examples, but all of them provide in silico medicine services. So what would have been the drivers for this progress? Of course, there is the progress in basic R&D in the technology itself, both in academia and in industry, but there are two important elements that are allowed for this boom to also happen, and that is explicit support from policy and explicit support from the regulatory. So the explicit support from policy is something that we as a community of academia and industry actively set out to find. So we contacted a lot of people. We did a lot of contact programs, a lot of information rounds to show what modeling and simulation was able to do. And we got very positive response from policymakers in EU and US, and also now in more and more other countries. So much so that at some point there was a call from the US authorities to develop a full human, or a call to FDA to develop a full human in silico model so that they could be able to test drugs and devices across the entire body. That was a very clear mandate. And around the same time, also in Europe, you saw that modeling and simulation was being entered into specific regulations, like, for instance, the medical device regulation. It mentions specifically the use of computer modeling and simulation generating data that should be considered in a regulatory submission. Something similar appeared also in the EMA regulation. And so that was also a clear show of support from the European authorities. So besides that, there was the advance in regulatory science related to everything in silico. We're now at the point that the data sources for regulatory are no longer considered to be just bench tests, animal in vivo data and human in vivo data, but also computer generated data. So digital evidence is now considered to be a valid data source in a regulatory submission. Now, the key in getting regulators to accept this in silico evidence is establishing credibility of the in silico models. And well, how do we do that? Well, 3 steps are important there. That's documentation, something called VVUQ, and standardization. Documentation, well, here you see the example of a guidance that was presented by the FDA, where they discuss if you want to include digital evidence in the context of a submission on medical devices. Well, they clearly describe what kind of evidence you need, what kind of information you need to include in the dossier. Per kind of model technology that you might consider using, they explain the information that they need to see to be able to evaluate your model. Now, VVUQ is then showing the credibility. VVUQ stands for verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification. Verification is showing that your mathematical model that you developed and the numerical solution that your computer simulation generates, that they are the same, so that you didn't make any mistakes in the numerics, in the software, in entering the data, that everything there is up to scratch. Validation is the next step, is showing that your simulation results correspond well to your physical reality. And then the third one is uncertainty quantification. Well, while making such a computer model, you make assumptions. You make assumptions on things to include in the model, things to leave out, on parameter values to feed your model. And uncertainty quantification, there you have to evaluate what the impact is of these assumptions. So if you change this parameter value in one or the other direction, what impact does that have on the predicted result, on the simulation result? And is my result then still reliable? So is my model reliable? All of this has to be done in a specific context of use for a specific question. So your model does not need to be valid across the board. It is evaluated in the context of a specific question that you want to present to the regulator. All of this has now been captured in a standard developed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, together with industry and regulators, called the VMV40, the Verification and Validation 40, which is a standard that was written for medical devices, but it was conceived in a very generic way that it actually also applies to other treatments or therapeutic strategies. Now, what does this VMV says? This starts from the identification of a risk. If you want to include your model in a regulatory submission, well, the first thing you have to do is show what is the risk of attached to your model. What is the influence of your model on the medical decision? And what is the consequence of a mistake in your model on the patient? Now, when both are very high, you need to do a lot of verification and validation. When both are very low, well, then the impact of your model will be lesser, and the risk attached to it will also be lesser. And so you have to do less VMV. Now, this is for the standard models, what you see on your right-hand side. They're also looking into now AI and machine learning models, which, if they are closed locked models, they could be treated in a very similar way. If these are self-learning algorithms, there is a whole lot of other things that need to be considered, because if the model learns from data, then in principle, every time it includes a new data set, the model changes and your validation needs to be done again. So that is an ongoing discussion still. In European context, there is discussions ongoing with notified bodies and with EMA and how to apply this and how to interpret this in a European context and how to apply this for drugs and devices in Europe. Now, I'd like to end with some current challenges for in silico medicine. And as I said, some of these are really generic and correspond very well also to the challenges of stricter e-health interpretations. The first one is the technology. So we need further development of the technology, because there's always things to improve there across time and length scales. We need to have better and more standardized methods for model assessment, for the definition of virtual patients if we want to pursue the in silico clinical trial route, and for combining clinical or experimental data with model data, how to do that, these hybrids. And then we need to link this to environmental information and link to the toxicology community, for instance. Another challenge is related to, of course, to data. If you use data to validate your model, well, then you need to make sure that your comparator data is valid. You need to show where you got it from. So you need this kind of birth certificate for data. So there needs to be interaction with biobanks, with Elixir, with a lot of other communities. And this is really something that across well, a lot of communities is a concern, the reliability of the data, and also, of course, the access to data. There is going to be a European health data space. This will take time, of course, to establish. So how, in the meantime, can we get access to real data? How do we deal with GDPR? How do we assess quality, quantity? And what can we do with the creation of synthetic data? Is this perhaps a route forward? A last series of challenges is the sustainability and the interactions with different communities. One sometimes says that the most important omics is economics. So the sustainability of such approaches is really important. And so all of the costs related to data requirements, compute cost, and the establishment of these models needs to be taken into account. We need to interact with the health technology assessment agencies, with the payers, to show how models can actually contribute to a safer and a better healthcare. We need to engage with patients and, of course, with clinicians, because if models need to become part of the clinical workflow, they need to be really integrated. Clinics is a high-pressured environment, so we have to make sure that these models are well integrated with what is already available in clinics. And so in order to get this really, to get this integration of in silico in healthcare, to push it really forward, we need to go towards something called good practices. In academia, this would be that we need to increase reliability, reproducibility, and reusability of whatever we do, so that we allow for an easier transition to industry. And as a field, both industry and academia, we should work on something called good simulation practices. In analogy to GMP, GCP, the GSP could define a set of guidelines that if you follow those, this would lead to a more easy regulatory acceptance and actually a deployment of the full potential of in silico medicine. So this was my last slide. I hope that with this overview of what is in silico medicine, where are we now, what are the drivers for these developments, and what are the current challenges, I have been able to give you. So this is it from my side.
So excellent presentation, Professor Liesbet. And I really learned some one-liners like the most important omics is economics. And I hope that Tonu was here and we could have asked him about the Estonian omics. You know, he comes from the biobank. And as per the agenda, you know, I've been allocated 20 minutes to make my own presentation. And as the moderator of the session, I have done some slides which are my take on all the 4 speakers today. So let me do it this way. Let me run a very quick, instead of 20 minutes, I try to do them in next 10 minutes, because as for the agenda, we are already 3 minutes late. So, and then I try to save more time for doing a more active conversation so that we can increase the Q&A time from 10 minutes to 20 minutes, and hopefully try to get Professor Liesbet talking to Bart, because both are coming on data, and I see that there could be interesting perspectives, from both of them. So without further ado, let me just share my presentation with all of you, and just sharing, almost everybody talked about AI and like deep learning, and this is what I saw in all of their slides, and at least Liesbet and Bart, you may react on this if I chose the right images from your slides, but I took liberty of choosing one image from every slide, and it would be also good to get a comment in the chat from the participants that if this is the same imagination that you saw, that I'm seeing across cutting from the 4 talks. But I think what was very inspiring for me, if these all 4 people are like samurais, like digital health samurais, I would draw a lesson from Tonu's talk, which is like knowing the precise move, you know and from Bart, it is about choosing your side, the side which does the greater good. And if I were to choose, if I were to draw a lesson from Professor Liesbet's work, I don't know, Professor Liesbet, if you would agree on this, but it's like the role of practice. We all know that how much emphasis is on, for a samurai on the practice aspect. And of course, Ayn, who is a medical doctor, but of course, coming from a cybersecurity and a blockchain company, so we also need to be very good in defense and maintaining the integrity of the data. So for me, these are the 4 samurai lessons from the 4 talks, and it would be good if you can all share in the chat whether you agree or disagree with my interpretation here. And uh, so what is my sharing with you? And as I said, I was supposed to give a 20-minute talk, but let me rush into quickly what I understand, and let me also add some fresh perspective to what you all have heard, right? So around December last year, I stumbled upon this document. It's called the Nordic Health Vision 2030, which basically talks about that how in the Nordics, in Europe, the healthcare is becoming unsustainable. And it is primarily because of the aging population, and 95% of the money is spent on the sick care of people who are older than 60 years. So let's say if you're a younger person in the Nordics, only the 5% of the allocated money is spent on your healthcare. And somehow, whether in India or elsewhere, we see that healthcare is almost like sick care. So the word health in healthcare is missing. So if you look at it from that perspective, what I found inspiring in this document is that they project this 5x5 aspiration, wherein they say that Nordics spend around 10% of their budget or GDP on healthcare, and they aspire in this document to allocate 5% of that on preventive. So I really believe that preventive is the way forward. And whether that preventive will come from the virtual physiological human, that vision of Professor Liesbet, whether it will come from what Bart is saying, that we have a data trust, or whether it will come from what Tonu is presenting to us, or what Ain showed to us. But of course, when we talk about preventive healthcare, I think we talk about, or we promise a world which is, let's say, much more accessible, because having said that, I come from India, and where 40% of the population lives in the urban area, so they have 80% of the healthcare is in the urban areas. So the rural population, the access is even more skewed. And I think digital is a big opportunity. Digital does not discriminate. So whether it is rural or urban, the access remains the same. So let me further, break my sharing with you today into two parts. One is the communicable aspect, and the other is the non-communicable aspect. So coming from the non-communicable aspect, 2 years back, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And around that time, I started this project called as Experiments with Sugar.in. And my own goal was to, overcome my own disease, which was type 2 diabetes. And for that, one of the things that I stumbled upon was, microbiome. That there is this good work from these professors from Israel, where they published this research work in Nature, and it talks about that the diet that I'm eating is going to give a very different sugar response to me vis-a-vis some other person eating the same food. And it depends on the microbiome in my stomach versus the other person's stomach. And hence, basis the research of this professor, the wife of this professor designed an app which is available in US. It's called Day 2. So you can organize a stool test, and they, by the stool test, they can sequence your gut biome, and you can look at the food, and they can tell you without before you eat the food, that what is going to be your blood sugar response. So this kind of work is very interesting for a person like me, who is suffering from metabolic condition. And of course, here in India, so I don't have access to these kind of advanced tests. So I'm using a machine like this to test my own body. And at the peak of my condition, I was testing 7 times in a day, and I would spend like 25 cents on per test. So let's say I on in the peak of my condition, I was spending close to €2 per day. And if you look at Wikipedia, the definition of below poverty line population is that population which earns less than €2 per day. So I always used to think, coming from this part of the world, that if I can spend €2 per day on just knowing what is my blood sugar level, there are people who just earn that much money, and they have to spend that money on their food and other priorities of life, not just testing the blood sugar. So if in India we look at 70 million people, looking at diabetes, having access to their own data points of the body will enable them to make better choices. But I think it needs to be cheaper. And when I look at a sensor like this, which you can put in your body, I'm sure some of you are familiar. So I have not used this kind of a device in the last 2 years, but it is available, and it is available by prescription. And recently I came to know of a startup in US which can run even for 1 month. So why I'm showing you this microbiome, or the this blood sugar monitoring, continuous blood sugar monitoring example, because I find after 2 years I have overcome my own diabetes condition. So I'm fully free of it now. And I think one important aspect for me was to go into a mode where I could collect more data about my own body, and somehow overcome my lifestyle condition. So having data about your own body is very important. And then let me quickly segue into the second part of this presentation. So if you are giving a presentation on healthcare in 2020, I think you cannot avoid the inevitable, which is COVID, right? So I see COVID as a change agent. And I think, at least in my country, overnight, a lot of regulations were passed. So healthcare has become an important topic in country like India, because of COVID. And I think in many parts of the world, of course, many of us, like Sven said, this seminar otherwise would have been more of a physical event, but now it's happening online. So it has changed many things, and it has changed many things for good. So I think, let me also show you a very small imagination here in the light of COVID, and how pandemic is changing how we do things around the world. So I came to know about this company called as Blue Dot some few days back, when I was teaching doctors about AI. And it turns out that this company Blue Dot was able to predict COVID, right uh, before, or let's say before anybody else could recognize. And I can see that these kind of applications or this kind of companies will become more and more popular. But at the same time, I believe that most of the world population was kind of caught off guard with the COVID situation. And I tried to search a lot of documents on European Union and elsewhere. I could not find preparation for COVID anywhere in the world in the government documents. So I think we failed, and I don't know if it comes again, what will be the situation. But it shows that we are always wiser in the hindsight, and we lack the foresight. But for the foresight, what do we need? We definitely need better sensors to detect in terms of accuracy and time. Of course, there is a race going on right now to find the vaccine. And while we have the vaccine, while we have the test, I think everybody is trying to live in the new normal. So let me just very quickly open some questions, which I recently saw this in a video shared by World Economic Forum, that Helsinki airport is using dogs to detect coronavirus. And then I learned more specifically about the noses of dogs, that how they can detect a single molecule, or even few hundred molecules, whereas the best of the test kits require a million molecule kind of a presence. So I think nature is really smart in detecting things. And I don't know if we can really emulate dogs in making those test kits. I don't know if the Neuralink device made by Elon Musk company could ever be fitted into dogs. And let's say we crowdsource the start of a pandemic like Blue Dot does. So maybe that's a crazy possibility for future. But let me bring to you a much closer reality. And when I see that imagine 6 months from now we have a vaccine. And if we talk about India, let's say compared to Estonia is 1.3 million people. India is 1.3 billion people. So we're talking exactly about 1,000 times bigger the context. So if we were to vaccinate India, and imagine we have the vaccine and we decide to vaccinate India, let's say in 4 months. So just imagine, the planning perspective, that if we were to vaccinate 1.3 billion people in India in 4 months, how many people do we need, who will go and vaccinate people, right? Maybe a million plus. What is the IT infrastructure we need to issue those certificates, what Ayn was talking about? So maybe we need an IT system which can take up 10 million entries per day. And how much money does Indian government need to buy the vaccines? I think one of the largest vaccine manufacturer is in India. So that person says Indian government needs 10 billion euros, to buy that much vaccine that they could give the population the vaccine. So it is a big challenge for a country like India. But I believe that India is the world's factory for producing vaccine, and also a good IT hub. If somehow magically India could combine these two strengths, and if it is able to vaccinate itself, let's say, 6 months down the line, I think India will have a winner, not just for itself, but for the world. because many of the countries in the world would rely on India for supplying the vaccine. And that's where we need, for the first time, we just don't need the vaccine alone. We also need this kind of infrastructure, which Ayn showed in his slide. So I have borrowed this slide from Ayn. And I see that, these are the two stories I wanted to share, complementing what I heard from all the four speakers. And this last slide is a tribute to Bart's ASCII filter. So I went on internet and generated my own ASCII image. So I can finish here, and I invite Bart and Professor Liesbet to open their cameras, and maybe come in a chat with me, if that's okay. Maybe unmute yourself.
I'm unable to activate my, yeah, now it goes.
Okay. So thank you both for sharing your inspiring thoughts. So before I open this for any kind of questions, let me first ask you each other, what is your reaction after listening to oneself? So Bart, what is your reaction listening to Professor Liesbet?
Well, it's a domain I learned so much, and it's a domain I want to really better understand, because my expectations as well in modeling, or AI as a general term, is that we will be able to reduce the cost of drug development, and that is from very early stage targeting to going from in vitro to in vivo. And the question is that if this is all getting automated, how do we get back that profit for society back into our healthcare system? So how do we, does this have an impact even on the length of IP of a specific product that somebody can have? Because if the cost of R&D and clinical trials reduce with a factor X, then there is no reason why somebody needs IP protection for 14 to 16 years. So it gave me quite a lot of hope and inspiration as well to look into that as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely inspiring. So your reaction, Liesbet, and also your reaction from vision of Bart,
Well, what Bart is referring to is exactly what I found so refreshing in his whole presentation. This other look on data. Usually when you get these talks about AI, they're very much focused either on the technology or the safety, but this idea of this community and yeah, that it's not a commodity, but that it belongs to the people. This is I find this very refreshing, and it indeed opens a whole lot of other possibilities that I hadn't even considered, like shortening the duration of the IP, like reducing not just the cost for the developer, but also the cost, of course, on the patient side. So I find this very, very interesting that that this could be also down the line of AI and modeling in general.
Yes, indeed, it's a very inspiring vision, Bart, that you have. But I think the devil lies in the details. And very first time when I moved to Finland as a student, I came to look for a guy called as Peter Westerbacka. So I don't know if you have known him, but he was one of the guys in Angry Birds. Okay, so this Finnish mobile company called as Rovio. And back in those days, in a Finnish bar called as Molly Melons, was run a movement called as Mobile Monday. So every Monday, people will gather for a beer and discuss about mobile. And that movement spread in 70 plus countries. So when I was, working as a software engineer in a company in India, so we started the Mobile Monday chapter in Delhi. So we never met any Finnish person before that, starting that chapter. It was kind of understood that this is how the things are. So the world is going crazy about mobile, and let's start a Mobile Monday chapter. So Mobile Monday will bring all the crazy people together, right? So how do you bring this kind of code of conduct, right, to this kind of movement that it could create thousands of Barts, all over the world. And maybe, once you have those kind of data trust, which have the right value system, I think, which is your core value proposition here, that could enable the work of like Professor Liesbet and others. So any remarks on that, Bart? How do you look at spreading it in a decentralized way?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your ASCII code trials. I really had to smile seeing those. When I started this journey, I took quite a lot of time to think what is the simplest way to create a framework that allows people to interact in. And I think with looking at the simplest form of data and data donation, and then licensing that data with an open knowledge model that leads into a very new ecosystem, or could create a very new ecosystem around open knowledge, which is open AI. So we ask participants if they create AI models or train the AI models out of our data, that they need to register these AI models in a public register. So that creates a very new kind of way of looking at creating it. And what we understood as well is, as you said, like I was not part of the Mobile Mondays. I was part of the quantified self. That's when you talk about research with n equals 1. It's not scalable, but it was an amazing movement. We had in 150 cities people gathering 2 times a month, and people were doing all these trials on themselves, and it created this whole hype. But as well, it created a lot of sharing. So people were sharing how they were hacking their life using data and optimizing their life at the end. And I think what we will do is works very strongly with a community, and what I want to avoid is creating an audience. Because if I create an audience, then we go into a kind of a dictation what the framework is. But we want to create communities locally, and we call them Hippo zoos. And definitely they will be localized and following those principles. At the same time, I connected to very old structured NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, for example, because it's for me an example on how the public is investing into humanitarian work. And I see this as some kind of, I don't see us as a Apache Foundation for developing software. I see us more as being positioned as the Doctors Without Borders humanitarian organization, because we are creating AI models or AI commons and data commons that can be used in Ethiopia or in other regions, and we are liberating knowledge that can be used in other regions. So and I think what we will need to do, and what we'll focus on in Germany, is really create an organization that collects donations. And with these donations, we will be able to deliver grants to research institutes, perhaps setting up global challenges that are connected to a specific work. So repeating quite a lot of the things that are already worked in the fields of research, but as well the innovation space. And on data, we use FAIR principles and existing frameworks. We're not going to reinvent the wheel when it comes to that. But there was so much difference in. Now we're starting our campaign with mammographic data, screening data, because it's simple and we can have impact. But I don't even want to touch as multi-omics data, because that's a whole different story. So we will have to work with these communities to solve together these issues. But yeah, I hope I can create a similar movement as with Mobile Mondays or Quantified Self, that is very decentralized.
So during the lockdown, we created 3 hackathons, and each one of them had around 10,000 participants. So 2 were on the COVID, and the third one was more general. So we have this tradition in India for last 4 years where 500,000 engineering students apply. So if you ever think of getting those 500,000 excited about the AI part, we are more than happy to support your vision there. And my next question to you, Professor Liesbet, you mentioned in your slides about FDA, and also you talked about US government, commissioning a full human model. And I have seen, very closely, at least in Europe, that EU also is, supporting research. So is there a similar initiative in Europe that like a full body model, or something that you are aware of, or is it only US which is taking a lead here?
So I don't think it is really ever the idea to develop a full human model. That would be too complicated. You would not need it. You would need an organ-to-organ systems, or a specific part of the whole body, like the metabolism, but never the whole thing. And I don't think that is what the legislators meant. It's just a simplified representation. And in that sense, in Europe, we're actually, with the whole VPH funding that we had over the last decade, I think we're doing quite well. And in terms of model development, together with New Zealand, we're actually, let's say, in the front. It's just on the regulatory side that FDA, because they have so many researchers in-house that are biomedical engineers and know about modeling, that they are taking the lead. So it's actually quite well balanced, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's good to know, because at least in your bio, which I didn't fully introduce, forgive me for that, but you mentioned that you are, working with the European Parliament. And so I thought maybe you are aware of the regulatory aspects as well in Europe. And indeed, I find that some of the FDA work is quite forward-looking. Even in the AI space, they are quite advanced. But I think, Bart, if I'm not wrong, some of your presentation give an idea that you're not looking to associate with government, but
With whom?
you're not looking to associate with governments. But I think if you want to bring, large scale change, you probably need to reevaluate that position. Because I say so because, right now this AI movement is going in a big way. And I've been following this conversation on, in EU, it's called common data spaces. So I don't know what is the viewpoint of both of you, Professor Liesbet and Bart, if you are aware of it, and where do you see your work linking into this common data spaces for the greater benefit of your work?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can maybe just indicate that for us, as in silico medicine, it has been very important to link up with government, with the parliament, with the regulators, in order to get this approved. Because if we want to push this to the patient, we need to pass the regulators, and in order to do that, they need to have a mandate, because they were a bit hesitant about incorporating this new technology that they didn't really know how to evaluate. So for us, this was a necessary step to get them on board, to be able to get our these technologies to the patient. I think it's good in a setting in Europe. It's really difficult if every country is setting up their own system. So it's nice that there are global initiatives. But yeah, those take time to develop. And I think the more people are trying to help, the better, as long as it's in some kind of concerted way. But that Bart probably has much more to say about those things.
Thank you. Well, on your comment on connecting to governments, when I did 3 interviews with founders of Doctors Without Borders, and they advised me not to connect or receive funds from governments, for the simplest reason that there is, for example, a reason why Iran still has an internet, because it's running Linux on open source. There is once you receive funds from a government, you can be controlled and directed into certain directions, or guided into certain directions. And one example was that Doctors Without Borders, they received once large fundings from the European Union, and then they were rescuing refugees in the Mediterranean Sea, and suddenly they're being controlled because they received funding. So staying neutral in that sense is extremely important, which does not mean, and I'm in discussions as well with the European Union for the 2021-2027 funding round. that we will not work on specific projects and creating the data sets we need. But I found it extremely difficult having conversations with politicians that are not going for such an extreme model that I am going for, which is, well, there is no privatization, there is no IP, there is no hybrid model, because I don't believe in a hybrid model. And why do I believe in a hybrid model? Is for the very simplest reason. I was asked, Bart, are you creating the data sets that help Google then to, or larger tech companies to further develop their already existing AI models? And is it not only going to accelerate their existing projects and their work? And I had to answer, yeah, most probably it will. And then it's like, how can you avoid it? It's like, perhaps we need a completely different view on this. And I don't know if it is possible, but I'm trying to preach and advocate within the political system that in Europe, it would be a nice idea perhaps to mandate by, like if you do an RFP in a hospital and you would acquire a software, that you would then set the standards that the algorithms you use for clinical decision support needs to be completely open and openly published. And you connect this to an open standard, because then if then these large monopolists or oligopolists come to your country, you say like, well, you can offer your solution, but you need to publish your model into an open register. And then you are not creating protectionism, you are actually forcing them to be open, because what they are doing is protectionism. And in a sense, we say like, we in Europe think very different, because in Article 35 of our fundamental rights is written that policies always have to be driven in such a way that Europeans get the highest access to healthcare services. So if you read that article, policies should actually lead to open knowledge and not to private knowledge in that sense. So that's kind of my take on this. I try to distance myself. I hope I get millions of followers. So I become a kind of country myself, or ourselves in the region, because what I presented in my presentation, what I learned during COVID, if you have a shared vision, people will follow, and then collaboration is easy. And I think my vision is quite clear, and I don't want to, as I said, create an audience to listen to me, but like we have set the framework and the vision, and I want people to follow that vision. And I think there are so many people, doctors and patients mostly, that want that different future.
I think indeed this work that you are doing, and I see that all 4 talks today, they have a convergence, and yet there is I would say a common denominator that we need to agree or define, and it's a very evolving topic. Maybe it's a very long debate. Maybe we cannot finish it today, and we are already 7 minutes over time. So it's so amazing for me. I should thank Ellery for bringing me in, because at least in this process I learned a lot. I learned from each one of you, and I really wish you success in your work. And I was involved with Sven, some time back, where Sven's organization called as Kanbal Forum. They were running the, as part of the German presidency of the EU, a program on, where they were aiming for the joint declaration. So this is one of the goal of the German presidency of EU, for a joint declaration on data spaces. And that's where I was thinking, Bart, that people like you could inform or influence these kind of work. Maybe you don't take funding, but your ideas, your visions, you can contribute in a very meaningful way. So I don't know, Sven, if you want to say any closing remarks, but I am done here, and I thank everyone for a very good participation, active participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Yes, as Sachin mentioned, we're already over time, but it means that the discussions were actually very relevant and very informative. So I'd like to thank everyone who participated today, and also Sachin for moderating the day, and sort of wrapping it up and binding together all the relevant input from all the presentations. So it was really very inspiring. So my sincerest thanks to all the participants, to the project, and hope to see you all again tomorrow, next week, and also in other CELIS events. So cheers and have a good evening.